Sorry, Sarah, can you reactivate the cameras, please?
Sure.
Okay. We're back.
Good.
Perfect.
Hi, everyone. You're very welcome to our webinar today. It's good to see so many people able to join us for this session on GDPR and data privacy. So we're very happy to have with us today Lisa Power, who is a certified data protection officer, and she is the DPO with Carne Group Financial Services. And we have Alan Higgins, who is CEO of Ingenium Digital, and Alan has several enterprises. He is an innovator in the digital health space and also a consultant in the digital health space. But he's talking to us about Ingenium Digital today, which Alan is running trials with the Limerick Hospital Group, and in order to do that, he had to dot all his I's and cross all his T's to satisfy HSE requirements. So Alan's going to talk you through that journey and let you know what needed to be done from a GDPR and data privacy point of view in order to become compliant with HSE requirements. So at the beginning of the webinar, you'll have seen that DConnect slides were rolling. So you may be familiar with what we do in DConnect. We support the digital health sector. So we're the Digital Health Innovation Hub based at Dundalk Institute of Technology, and we provide business supports, training, mentoring, and consultancy for digital health companies. So if you haven't spoken to us already and you would like to know what we can do to help you, please do contact us. We are funded by Enterprise Ireland and other funders from the private sector. So most of our services are provided free of charge. So please come to us and ask us what we can do to help your company, to help you to grow and scale. So I'm now going to pass over to Lisa, who is going to talk to you about everything you need to know in relation to GDPR and data privacy to be compliant, stay compliant, and satisfy GDPR regulations. Okay, Lisa, thank you. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. And I'll just share my slides now, if that's okay. So firstly, thanks for the opportunity to present to you all. In terms of just a little bit of background on myself and Carne Group, so I pivoted around the time that the GDPR was coming in. I went back and studied data protection. I'd always had a background in compliance and financial services. So it made sense then to make the move into data protection. I came to Carne Group at the beginning of this year. So Carne Group is a provider for the asset management industry. So we lend support, and it could be everything from us actually operating as a management company for a particular fund to doing MLRO, money laundering reporting officer services, AML, KYC, distributor due diligence, the whole gamut of services that basically within the asset management industry. So I am going to assume a reasonable amount of knowledge from you guys. However, please do stop me or put a message in the chat, a question in the chat at any point if you want to. I did include in the pack some definitions if you need them. In terms of just a bit of background about data protection law, you'll all have realized that it's heated up recently, but some people just aren't aware of the background of it. And a lot of this really came out of, there was a paper written right back in 1890 by 2 US lawyers, which actually introduced this right to be left alone, which we now call the right to be forgotten. But most latterly, it really heated up around World War II when we saw that the use of census data to commit, atrocities, we needed to actually regulate the use of data and what it could be used for. So that accelerated it. Now, what we're really at is we're trying to catch up with technology. So we're playing this chasing game, and technology most of the time tends to be winning. But regulation is really trying to keep up with what technology is allowing in terms of the pervasive use and sharing of data. So GDPR is obviously the big thing. You'll all have noticed it. Unless you never had an email account, you will have been bombarded in or around May 2018 in relation to it. What it was trying to do was standardize data protection. The key thing, it's also kind of uplifted the standard because its application is anybody who within Europe. Even if your entity isn't set up in Europe, you still are applicable if you're selling services to European residents. So it's raising the bar, and we've seen that now with Cayman Islands, the Californian privacy law, are all now uplifting to pretty much, if you read them, it's very hard to tell the difference between them and the GDPR. So it has raised the game globally in terms of data protection. These are the definitions. I'm just going to draw your attention to one, which is the third one down there, data processing. The key difference with the GDPR was it broadened it to basically anything to do with data, because a lot of the big tech companies were trying to kind of find a wormhole, find a little loophole out of this. Because they're saying storing, collecting, retrieving, it's basically anything. If you have access to data, you are processing data. So there's nowhere to hide. So some of them were kind of trying to say, oh, well, we don't put the data there, other people put it there. If you store it, if you make it available to people, then you're processing data. So it's broadened that out. So if we go into the principles, these are what underpin it. And there are 7 principles. The key thing is within all of this, the last one, accountability. And I know Alan's going to come on to talk more about this, but within everything you do on data protection, it's documenting it. The one thing I would say about the GDPR is it's a risk-based approach. Any organization that tells you that they're 100% compliant is probably lying, because it's so hard to be 100% compliant, but everything is a risk-based approach. So if there's an area where you know you cannot comply in full, you need to document the risk, show that you've assessed that risk and log it, so that being in breach is not defensible if you haven't actually realized that you might be in breach and looked at and done it on a risk basis. So lawfulness, fairness, the key thing here is no surprises. No data subject should be surprised at what you're doing with their data. Purpose limitation. If you get data for a specific purpose, you can't then go and use it for another purpose if you haven't told the data subject that you're going to do this. Data minimization is logical, right? You should only get the minimum amount of data. And I'm sure you've all filled out forms that are asking for your home address when they do not need your home address at all. Data must be kept up to date. You need to keep it for the minimum amount of time necessary for the purpose, but be careful with that one, right? Because sometimes you do need to retain under a legal obligation. So don't rush to delete data without checking your retention schedules. And then integrity and confidentiality. So making sure it's kept securely, that it's only available to the people who need to have it, etc. So on the lawfulness piece, most of you are probably aware of these. The one thing I would caution you is if you're relying on consent, it's the weakest lawful basis. It must be freely given. So if there's any imbalance of power in the relationship, you can't really rely on consent. So for example, in the employer-employee context, you can't really rely on consent because there's an imbalance of power. Also with consent is it can be withdrawn at any time. So it's very, very weak lawful basis to rely on. The other one I would point out is legitimate interest. If you're doing legitimate interest, there's what's called a legitimate interest assessment. So you need to make sure that there's nothing that you're doing that would impact the fundamental rights and freedoms of the data subjects. Most of you will probably be working around contract, which is great. It's a much stronger lawful basis. You just need to make sure that you have the right clauses in your contracts. And I'll come on to that in a little bit, especially if you're doing any data transfers to third countries. So one of the big things with the GDPR was it was trying to put the power back into the hands of the data subject. So they gave them a load of rights. Most of you are probably aware of these, right? But you need to, as an organization, you need to make sure that you have processes and procedures in place to fulfill these rights in a timely manner. I do a regulatory horizon scan pretty much every month, and I circulate it to the business here. And I would say 50% of the fines and the reprimands that are handed down by regulators across the globe are in relation to rights that either haven't been fulfilled in a timely manner, or weren't done completely, or to the satisfaction of the data subject. So a data subject right, somebody who's exercising their right, you need to take that as a red flag, because typically it's somebody who they're disgruntled for some reason or another, typically. So you need to make sure that you handle these correctly. In terms of the fines, we're getting up into huge figures now at this stage across the globe. This one doesn't, this is the enforcement tracker website, right? So it updates monthly. It hasn't even reflected the 265 million fine that was handed down to Meta just this week. But you'll see the biggies. The Irish regulator is very, very hot in this space. Interestingly, the regulators that are handing down the biggest fines in terms of monetary value aren't handing down the most fines. Spain, for example, fines a lot more, but just not to the big monetary value that Ireland and Luxembourg, they're the two highest so far. The two biggies being Amazon and Meta. And most of these are around technical and organizational measures, or TOMs as they're called, making sure you have the right controls in place to govern your data. So another piece that you'll need, and every organization needs, is robust breach management. Unfortunately, nobody wants to believe that it will happen to them, but as long as organizations are handling data, and as long as you're using email to share data, the chances are there will be a breach. It might not be a reportable breach, but there will be a breach. You have a regulatory obligation to maintain a log of all data breaches. Now, I would draw your attention to the definition of a data breach, because it doesn't just include, people think of breach as leakage of data. It's not just leakage of data. It actually includes loss of availability. So for example, if you have a core server that goes down and data is no longer available to data subjects, that could represent a data breach and needs to be logged. So the criteria for being reportable are that it needs to represent a high risk to the rights and freedoms of the data subjects. So which is subjective, right? You need to make a call. So something like an email, if somebody's passport, if you sent it to if you had somebody's passport and you sent it to the wrong person, if there's enough that somebody could commit identity theft, then that represents a high risk to the rights and freedoms. If it's just, somebody's work email address that you happen to put in CC of something, then that's unlikely to be a data breach, a reportable data breach. So in terms of tips around data breach management, ensure you have a procedure and a log of all of the incidents. Check that all your third-party vendors that you deal with, that there are clauses in all of your contracts, and they have a contractual obligation to report any breaches to you. Know who your lead supervisory authority is. For most of you, it'll probably be Ireland, in which case it's the Data Protection Commissioner. And on her website, there is a breach reporting portal that you can go into. She has actually changed her methodology recently so that up until before she would actually, her office would actually actively engage with you after reporting a breach. Now you actually report and they won't come back. They will leave the onus to you to come back and update them. And that's purely just on a capacity basis because of the volume of work that they're dealing with at the moment. So email is the biggest culprit across the board. If you look at all the regulators' reports, email is always the biggest culprit. There are little controls you can put in place. You can have like Tessian or Titus controls. There's data loss prevention controls built into a lot of your Office 365 tools. The simplest thing is putting a 2-minute delay, 1 or 2 minute delay in Outlooks so that you have that kind of get out of jail free card. So it will sit in your outbox for a while before it actually goes. So if you do realize that there was somebody in the CC line that shouldn't have been in it, or that you'd attached the wrong file, you can go in and get it before it actually sends. The other thing is delete data. You know, it's challenging if you have a data breach. It's indefensible if you have a data breach of data that you shouldn't have any longer, that you should have deleted it. So you need to make sure you have robust deletion methodologies and retention periods defined. And then the other one, and this is one that people so frequently forget, is clean up after yourself. If you move from one vendor to another, invoke the clause that in your contract that dictates that that vendor must delete your data once you've transferred everything that you need. A lot of people forget that one, and that is one that has led to quite a few fines. So if we look at an example, and I tried to pick one that might be in the space that you guys are operating in, because I know you're in the health space. So this was one that was handed down by CNIL. That's the French regulator. So this was with medical data that was leaked. So, and it was exactly what we were talking about. It was a migration of software from one provider to another provider. There were a couple of things. They took too much data. They shouldn't have been transferring some of the data, and there was a lack of sufficient security around it. So in that case, that led to a fine of 1.5 million. So these are useful because you can take a lot of learnings from some of these, watching this kind of landscape and seeing what's happening here. So a few other obligations that you have to maintain a register of processing activities. So any process that you do that involves personal data, you need to document. There are templates on the regulators' websites that are quite helpful, but it needs to include what are the data elements, what are the categories, who do you share it with, how long do you retain it for, what security measures do you have in place. So there's a very defined structure for that. And if you ever have to defend yourself in front of a regulator, that will be the first port of call that they will go to. They'll want to see your register of processing activities. We talked a little bit earlier about transfers of data and contracts, especially around contracts. So this is a really hot space at the moment. There's something called a third country. So a third country is any country outside the EEA that is not deemed to be adequate in terms of the level of data protection that it affords to data subjects. Notable ones that are adequate are Canada, New Zealand, Switzerland. So you've got some biggies in there. The ones that aren't, USA, Singapore, Hong Kong, etc. So if you're engaging with any entities that are based in those countries and that are where the data is located in those countries, you will need additional safeguards. You'll need standard contractual clauses in those contracts, and you'll need to complete what's called a transfer impact assessment to show that you've actually reviewed the risks for that data. I put this slide in because there is a deadline on this, right? You need those standard contracts. If you currently have contracts in place and they don't have those clauses, the deadline for the grandfathering agreement is the 27th of December of this year. At that point, all contracts must be uplifted to the new standard. I've put a link in here so you can see where the standard contractual clauses are if you do need to go and check. And there are 4 different modules depending on the nature of the relationship, whether you're as a data controller and the entity is a data processor, or whether it's processor to processor. I don't want to get, this can get really, really messy and complex, so I won't go into too much detail here. I guess the key message is make sure your contracts have the right clauses in them. So I guess for most of you guys, the big ticket piece is going to be privacy by design. You're building new systems, you're building new applications. So you need to make sure that you can evidence that from the outset, you have built in privacy by design and by default. The methodology that's typically used here is what's called a data protection impact assessment, or a DPIA. So a DPIA has to be in place for anything that is likely to present a high risk to rights and freedoms again, or a high risk to data subjects. There are other triggers, mandatory triggers. So for example, if you're migrating data from one system to another, or carrying out very large scale processing, or processing large volumes of sensitive data. So for example, health, criminal data, political data, etc. Sarah, is there a question? What about a breach of anonymized data? Is this required to be reported? Thanks for the question. So no, okay, so that's a very good question actually, because anonymizing data is harder than you might think, right? You need to fully anonymize the data. So there has to be absolutely no opportunity or no potential for that data to be associated with a natural living person. If you have truly anonymized the data, then you do not need to report that. However, what you do need to do is you need to log it in the data breach log that you maintain, and you need to document the rationale that you used for not reporting it. So they're the key things. I hope that answers the question. So in terms of going back to the DPIAs, then anything that involves profiling or automated decision making, you have to have a DPIA. So again, there are very, very defined guidelines. The regulators have templates on their websites for these. The one thing I would say is that the sooner you can get started on them, the better, because it's very hard to retrofit privacy when you're very far down the development path. And I know, Alan, you'll probably come on to this in more detail. If you're doing smaller changes, if you don't think a DPIA is required, but it's a smaller change, it's still prudent to look at privacy by design. There are checklists you can use. Again, actually, the UK regulator is really strong in this space and provides some really good templates. And I've put the link in. Actually, no, I've got the Data Protection Commissioner's link here. If you look up the ICO as well, ico.co.uk, I think it is, they have very good templates there if you need any guidance on this one. So I've just come on the next slide with some details around tips, pointers for completing a DPIA. As I said, start at the earliest possible opportunity. As soon as you start, most of the DPIAs that I would complete for our organization, they become much harder if people have already started work on the initiative, and then you're trying to retrofit it in. There will be questions in a DPIA that you won't have answers for, and that's okay. That's what the DPIA is designed to do. It's designed to make you think in a way you might not necessarily have thought. And as the main point is to go and actually look up the answers and go and find those answers for those. The other piece is to be honest in a DPIA. Don't put something in that you think is the right answer. It needs to genuinely be the right answer, because God forbid, if something does go wrong, your DPIA will need to be produced, and you will need to use it in your defense. So you need to be honest in there. And if there is something that comes out and it highlights a high risk, that's the power of it. And then you can go in and you can address it and you can remediate it. Also, a DPIA isn't a one-off exercise, and this is something that a lot of people struggle with. Certainly some of the PMs in our industry find it frustrating, is that you don't just sit down and do a DPIA and then you walk away. You will come back to it again and again and again, because things will come up. The landscape will change. Your vendor will come to you and say, actually, we're moving our data and it's no longer going to be here, it's going to be there, or we're now using a new third party, or whatever it is. So you need to keep coming back to that DPIA and updating it. I have DPIAs that are on version 17, and we're not even completed the project at this stage. So you need to just understand that it's an iterative process. And what it will flesh out is your data flows. And this is where the power is. And this is where it comes back to that register of processing activities. You need to know not just where you are processing data, but where your vendors are processing data, and really understand where that is, not just geographically, but across just in general across vendors. Also think to the future. When you're doing your DPIA, look at, a lot of people think about data ingestion and how are we going to process it. You need to think to the end of the life cycle. How am I going to delete data? How long am I going to keep data for? When is it no longer purposeful? When will my lawful basis for having it expire? And how will I expunge and fully delete that data? So if you can think about that before you bring in the data, you will make it much easier when you get to the end of the life cycle of that data. And then risks. Work on your highest risks. There's a section, it's usually section 4 and 5 of most DPIA templates, that looks at what are my risks and what am I doing to mitigate them. And that's the really powerful piece of the DPIA, that's where the honesty comes in. Be really honest. What are my risks? Rate them high, medium, low, medium, high, and go after your high ones first and look at mitigating those ones first. And especially in the startup world, if your DPIA involves, or if your initiative involves a vendor or a key third party, perform a full due diligence on them and their practices. And if necessary, engage them in the DPIA process. Have them help you fill out the DPIA and work through it with you, because a lot of the bigger ones will have been through this before, and you can leverage their experience within that. So for more hands-on experience, I will hand over to Alan, but I will just open the floor just at this point if there are any questions.
Thanks, Lisa. I don't see any questions there in the Q&A. If participants, oh, sorry, we do have one. If GDPR applies to a living person, are there any legal responsibilities to consider if you hold someone's data who has died?
I've had this in a particular case with a probate case. So the GDPR applies to a natural living person. To be brutal, the dead do not have data protection rights. However, what I would say is that they do have living persons associated with them who have sensitivities. So I would just the key point around this is delicacy, is what I would advise. Again, you will have legal obligations to retain data, so you can fall back on those, and that's what we had to do in a really big probate case that I was dealing with in my previous organization. We had a next of kin who wanted their deceased parents' details deleted. We had to just be sensitive about it and go back to them and say, we have a legal obligation to retain, but rest assured that as soon as that legal obligation has expired, we will delete your father's data, etc. So understanding your retention periods, again, it comes back to that, and being able to place reliance on them. And as I said, sensitivity in dealing with the living person associated with it, because typically if they're exercising rights, it will be a living person associated with them.
That's super.
Sorry, there's another question. Sorry, Sarah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Great. DPO training courses, that's a really good one. Okay, the landscape has changed on this again, right? So the best course, I think, is the IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. That will actually land you with what's called a CDPO, or Certified Data Protection Officer accreditation. So it's through the the International Association of Privacy Professionals, and it's this. What you want to be doing is the CIPPE, which is the European module if you're going to be processing data for European citizens. There's also CIPP US if you're going to be primarily operating in the US. There's another one, CIPM, but I would say CIPPE is the kind of good foundation one if you're looking for training.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And I don't think we have anything else at the moment. Great questions, folks. Keep them coming. Thank you for them. And so I'm going to hand over to Alan. And Alan, you take it away from a boots on the ground point of view. And we'll be interactive. So if questions come in as you're speaking, I'll let you know. Alan, you're on mute. Sorry. Sorry, Alan, I unmuted you while you unmuted yourself, and now you're muted again. Sorry, double negative.
We'll go from there. Can you hear me now?
Okay, great. I can.
Excellent,
thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Lisa, for opening the session. I think some really good perspective from the overall side. And I suppose, first of all, to Sarah and the team, thank you all for the opportunity to join the call. Ingenium ourselves, I'm lucky enough that I'm one of the founding members of the organization back in 2014. Ingenium, through its history, has specifically focused on strategy, learning and development, and health and safety. And then in 2021, we introduced the Digital Solutions Organization, for which I'm head of. So I've been on an interesting journey over the last 2 years with the digital side, where we focused in on healthcare, because we felt that's where we were able to bring some good solutions and look at some of the challenges that we're in e-health and digital healthcare in Ireland, and especially through the e-health MBAC program with Dundalk IT and the team there earlier this year helped us shape some of the products and services that we are bringing to market. But one of the things I want to just spend a little bit of time on is looking at our journey with the HSE from a data privacy, data perspective. So that whole onboarding process of becoming a HSE approved supplier, and also working with what will be Regional Health Area E, so UL Hospitals Group and Midwest Community Health, and projects that we've implemented with them. And just looking more specifically at, as a startup, you land that first big contract with the HSE, and then you get this myriad of documentation into your inbox. And it's like, where do I start, or what do I need to look at? So it's providing an overview of what we went through, and also looking at some personal elements, and a lot linked back to what Lisa was speaking about. The first one is looking at the whole area of the data processing agreement. And it's the first document that you will open. And what that does is the agreement that covers the processing of all and any HSE personal data under the contract between ourselves and the HSE itself. And the areas that we look at there is the obligations on us as the provider, the data protection impact, any technical and operational measures that are contained within the process or within the project that we're doing. A big one that they focus in on is the sub-processors. So if you're bringing third-party data, or if you're bringing third-party data providers into that conversation, how do you look at getting them and their T's and C's? Looking at the data breaches, the personal data audits. A big piece that Lisa spoke about a short while ago was that whole accountability and the audit side of having no surprises. And then it looks at how do you go about the termination or the completion of the agreement when a project comes to an end. So how do we get through the deletion or termination of data from that perspective? When we look at it, the two big things for me out of this was it's a legally binding document, and that's something to be very, very mindful of. We read through the document, and some of it made perfect sense, but some of it didn't. And that's where, if you have any doubts whatsoever, bring in a legal team to review it on your behalf or make any explanations to you, because that's basically protecting yourself to ensure that you're complying with what they're outlining in the document. And the second one then is the use of your sub-processors. So, the company name, the location, as Lisa just mentioned, is very, very important. Where is that data being stored? The types of services being provided by that, and that geographical location of where processing takes place. One of the advantages of being with the eHealth MBAC program was that we had access to Amazon Web Services. And the team at Amazon were really, really good in helping us understand that piece and setting ourselves up for success in that core element. So that's one of the big areas, and it's an 8 to 10 page processing agreement document that you do need to spend a bit of time on and go down and read through it. And if you have any questions, it really is about engaging representation from your side, because you want to be going into this with full disclosure, with open and honesty from that perspective. The second document then, and this is the big one, this is a 74 question, 32 page security assessment. And what the HSE are trying to do here is they're trying to assess the technical and operational measures that we have put in place as an organization. So what we're looking at is this list of 12 information areas. First of all, looking at the location, ownership, and the outsourcing of the data protections. As an organization, what are the IT security controls and security management you have in place? You're then looking at the whole element of, if the system goes down, what's the backup and recovery? What's the disaster recovery elements? So that you can get the system or platform back up and running in a safe and secure manner.
Alan, sorry to stop you there, but one of the participants has just said that your sound is not very good.
Okay.
Is your microphone covered, or maybe rubbing against something, or?
Is that any better?
Yeah, talk again and I'll tell you.
Okay. So what we're looking at here is the whole element of personal security. And from personal security point of view, you're looking at who has access to the system, who has access to the data. So basically the HSE want to know who are the authorized resources within your organization. And you do have to provide the list of names, roles, responsibilities, and why that person is accessing that data. Then you're looking at, from a support point of view, from basically an annual maintenance and support, what support aspects are you providing? Incident response, then looking at how your system is being developed and the maintenance of that. And then the cloud computing aspect is, if you're using the likes of cloud hosted services, what are they, who are they with, and again looking at that whole controls process around that. And for us, the big piece here was the elements of supporting documentation. And I know it was something Lisa made reference to. It's building all of that supporting documentation as you go along. So having copies of your certificates, your policy documents. Even as a startup, you'll start to build these documents, making sure that they are up to date, making sure that when you build them, that they're just not sitting in a cupboard somewhere, that they're out, that they are being refreshed, that they reflect where you are today on your startup journey. And then any other relevant information and other documentation that they request. One of the things that we had the huge benefit of was that when we were working with the UL Hospitals Group team, their data team and their procurement team were really helpful in terms of letting us know, well, we need to attach these documents, and kind of supported us through that documentation piece. But certainly from as early as possible, get that supporting documentation in place and then keeping it up to date. The second one then is know your third-party service providers. Where does the data sit? What support and recovery processes have they got in place if your system goes down? And first and thirdly, then it's your own processes and procedures. So do you have a data processing officer? Do you have documented data protection policies? What is your audit process for your data? What is your compliance with the GDPR principles? So from data processing, accountability, certainly looking, two key elements that I've just picked up on Lisa's is purpose limitation and data minimization. The purpose limitation one is ensuring that you are only using the data for the project that it is assigned to. That's one of the big key aspects that they look at. And data minimization. So for one of the projects that we did with UL Hospitals Group last year, we were looking for 4 key items of data to make that system happen. That's all we were looking for. So
Alan, sorry to stop you again. You're breaking up a little bit for me. I just wonder if, sorry, just one second. I just wonder if the participants can hear you. Oh yeah, maybe that would be good, Alan. Thank you. I can hear you okay, but we're missing little bits, and you know, as you're breaking up a tiny bit. Okay, let's go.
Okay, sorry about that, Sarah.
Okay.
So the key element with this document is that it's a large document. It takes time. It's not something that you're going to run through in an afternoon. It is something where I certainly would say, if you're using a third-party supplier, bring them into the conversation. Bring them into the whole element of completing this document, because the more information you get completed in this document, the easier it is then as you go down through and engage with the team. The third document then that we speak about is the privacy impact assessment, or the PIA, or the DPIA, as Lisa referred to. And that's basically to look at ensuring that the patient and service users' rights to privacy and confidentiality are appropriately protected. There's 6 key sections in this, and section 4 is the one we'll certainly highlight around risk and risk mitigation. So making sure, again, as we do not have legitimate access to personal data, we've unwanted modifications to personal data, or we have personal data disappearance. So when you're building a platform and you're engaging on that platform, it's to ensure that you have got very, very tight controls, regulations, and processes and procedures in that. Elements to be mindful of and questions to ask for you as the project, or as you're engaging with the client. Are you collecting personally identifiable data? So as part of the project initiation or planning phase, ensure you're working out and mapping out the input requirements into the project. So what do I need to make this project happen? What do I not need? Working with the client to identify any systems you need access to, and having the key basics in terms of what do I really need out of this system? I don't need access to all of the data. What are the key lines of a database, or what are the key areas of the database that you need access to? So really from your side, the less that the minimum amount of access you need, the better. So certainly from that, collecting that personal identifiable information, the less of that you have on your platform, or that you need, the better it is for yourself. And as part of the PIA, there is mandatory training that needs to be completed, and that goes through the HSE lands, GDPR and data protection and awareness training. That is something that is done, and we have to do annually. But again, different projects will require different elements of training that need to happen, and they're all conditions of ensuring that the project is a success. And finally, then the fourth document, if you get this far, is the network access agreement, and that again looks at the terms and conditions of how and where you're going to access the HSE network and information technology. So what you want to be mindful here is the purpose. So you only need to access the network for approved business purposes. So again, getting back to that element of purpose limitation. Access. Only the employees nominated by ourselves as the supplier to the product will have access to that network. And as I said already, that access is reviewed and approved by the HSE, and any changes to employees who need access to that it has to be sent written request to the HSE to make any changes on that. And then the annual review. So again, the HSE will look for an up-to-date list of the employees who have access to the network and why, and giving that information. And the final couple of elements then is responsibility. So at the end of the day, as the third party, we're responsible at all times for the activity that happens on that network when we're using it. So we need to ensure that the usernames and passwords that are granted to us by the HSE are not shared, that the password updating is follows the HSE policies and guidelines for password generation. So certainly making sure that only the key people in your organization who require access to the HSE network have it. Consent, that must be obtained written consent before implementing any changes or amendments to your project if it's engaging with the HSE network, information systems, or critical applications within the healthcare environment. So certainly making sure that any updates that you're making to a program or a project or a process, that you've gotten that release agreement from the HSE. So again, there's no surprises when you come to launch or you come to update a program or a system within their network. Finally, then the legislation piece. We must manage and process all HSE data which is required by the HSE and the Data Protection Acts of 1998 and EU directives. So when you look at the journey through the HSE onboarding to become an onboarding supplier, it may seem daunting. It's not, because the more processes and procedures that you can have in place beforehand, the easier it is to complete this documentation, and the easier it is to get signed off. Certainly, working with the HSE's procurement team, they're there to help you and to assist you. So certainly having that open and honest conversation with them, engaging your third-party supplier. So as I said, we were lucky enough to have Amazon Web Services who have been through this journey, engaging with them and having that conversation will be the key takeaways from me as I finish up right now. Apologies for any technical issues during that.
Alan, that was super, and I'm just going to go through that slide with you now, because there was a little bit of technical interference there while you were talking. I caught all of it, and I hope that all our participants did, because it was certainly very helpful. So we must know, Lisa referred earlier to holding as little data as possible about a data subject. So your first point there is that you must know the purpose. So that would refer back to only holding data on a subject that you have, that you know the purpose for. Am I correct there, Alan?
Correct. So the purpose, so if I look at one of the projects that we did with UL Hospitals Group around their visitor patient management system, there was 4 pieces of data that we required, that we were pulling from a large database. We only needed those 4 pieces of data. So the purpose of that data was to drive that piece of software. So from our perspective, the network connection that we needed, it was to go in, access a database, and pull 4 elements of that database, because that's all we needed for that project.
Okay, and now when we go back to the access piece, so only employees that have been nominated by the third party. Am I right in saying that the third party is no? So you tell me who the third party is, because and who the employees are. Are they your employees, or who's the third party?
Yeah, so the third party in this case is ourselves as the agreement. The third party will be Ingenium, and it's our employees of Ingenium who require access to the network.
Okay. So before you or as you're entering into an agreement with the HSE, you have to nominate the employees who will have access to the data, and no one else is allowed to access that data.
Right. So from our perspective, we nominated myself as the project manager and our 2 developers who are assigned to that project. That is it.
Okay, and Lisa, I'm going to come back to you now because Alan's next point about an annual review. So Lisa, you said that we need to have a risk register and our process is very well documented. And then we review those annually. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And everything that you're working with will need an annual review. So you're going to need, one of the things that we didn't explicitly reference was a privacy notice. So especially if you're operating on a website, if you remember, the first principle is lawfulness, fairness, and transparency, right? So under the transparency piece, you have to make available to data subjects at the point where they first provide their data, a privacy notice, which outlines what you're going to do. That needs to be reviewed annually at a minimum. If you have a data protection policy, your procedures, all of those need to go through review. Likewise, if you do a gap analysis or your register of processing activities, all of those need to be revisited. And I would say especially your register of processing activities, you need to come back to that more frequently than once a year, because that does change quite significantly.
Okay, and then moving on to responsibility. So that's back to access, that only people who have the right to access data can access the data. So I'm going to come back to you there, Lisa. So I know with AWS, you can, or most infrastructures, you can set up different levels of responsibility. So different levels of employees have different access to data. Do you think that that's a good framework to use in order to make sure that only essential people are accessing data?
It should start as a good framework. However, it's only as good as the user, and making sure that the user does go in and check those recertifies, and that you have a periodic review where you go in and you check, especially for movers, leavers, like people who change jobs, etc. Going back in anytime there's any movement and saying, are the right people accessing the right data for the role that they're now doing, because that can change over time.
Okay. And then obtaining the written consent of the HSE before implementing any updates or amendments to the HSE. So again, that's review. Would I be correct in saying that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Alan, probably you might be best to talk to that one because it's specific to the HSE. But for any of them, you need to keep coming back. This landscape is changing. I mean, even if you just look at the likes of the Schrems 2 case, which meant that every contract that involves a third country has to go under review. We're dealing with a moving landscape here, so you need to keep coming back and keeping an eye on what's happening in the wider landscape and seeing how it applies to you.
Okay, and that includes keeping an eye on legislation, which is the last point.
Absolutely, especially.
And can I ask both of you, I'll go to you first, Lisa, and then we'll go to Alan. How do I, as a data processor or as a third party, keep an eye on the legislation? Where do I get that information?
So the first point is understanding who your lead supervisory authority is. So once you understand that, you've got a great head start. There are some super websites that can give you that will give summaries, and I can provide links actually after this, Sarah, for some of them that you can easily subscribe to. They're free. You can pay nuts money as well, right? And the likes of the Allen and Overys and One Trusts and of this world, have great systems. But I would suggest that it's probably overkill for a lot of this audience. There's free ones that they sign up to. So I'll provide links afterwards and you can circulate them if that helps.
Super, thank you. And will those websites send me an alert if there's a legislation update? They
send you an alert of any legislative updates, but then also one of the big things, and this comes back to what I was saying earlier, they'll tell you big fines or reprimands that were handed down. And that's where that is where I find the power is. That's where the learnings are. It's like, okay, I'll now dodge this bullet and learn from where they went wrong. So that's what I would recommend people be watching out for.
Okay, super. Thanks very much. Now, Alan, I jumped in there at the end of your slide. Had you finished your presentation or have you got more to go?
No, I had indeed. That was everything, Sarah.
You had? Okay, let me just check. There are no questions in the chat. I'll invite the participants to pop their questions into the chat if you have any. Do you have anything else to add? Lisa, thank you very much for offering to give us that fantastic resource. I wonder if we can share your slides with the participants after the
webinar.
Yep.
What I'll do, Sarah, I'll get you those links for the so for people to do like a regulatory scan, and then I can add those to the slides and then maybe share them, so then for completeness they'll have everything.
Okay. And Alan, can I ask you from a resource point of view, when you were preparing to do business with the HSE, how long did it take and how many people did you have working on it?
It's,
And how many nights sleep did you lose?
I suppose from when you look at public versus private sector, the two operate in a very different cadence. So when we first got the details in and the suite of documentation, it was open the documentation, scroll and see how much do we have to do. It's a conversation and a journey. I suppose we were 3 months going through that series of documentation, with the longest being the IT supplier, the supplier onboarding. It's, as I said, it's 74 questions of really intense accuracy that you need to provide, and certainly having a lot of the documentation already done out. But we certainly then had to go and seek advice and guidance from AWS on the third party, on the supplier, on the processing side, because we didn't have the technical knowledge that they would be able to have. It was resources, it was me full time, and then my 2 technical developers bringing in the technical aspects to answer the questions, and then certainly brought in our legal team for help more than anything else, because you're reading the documentation and you can quickly get lost in some of the verbiage of it. So certainly about a 3-month period, Sarah, but I would say, that's end to end, including the back and forth between ourselves and the agency.
Okay, thank you, Alan. And your mention of AWS there gives me a nice segue into my final presentation. So I'm just going to share here the program that you completed with ourselves and AWS. Alan, can you see that? Can you see the presentation? Yeah. Okay. So is it in presentation mode?
Not yet.
Okay. Let's just see. Now, is that in presentation mode?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Alan mentioned there that he got assistance from AWS with this process. So Alan worked with ourselves on a program called eHealth Embark this year, and it's a 6-week program, and it's a digital health accelerator program that we run in DConnect in collaboration with the Connected Health and Wellbeing Cluster in DKIT and AWS, along with their sponsors DKIT and Enterprise Ireland. It's 6 full-day seminars that cover a very wide variety of topics that you need. Here in the Nuts and Bolts webinar series, we've covered 6 topics. We would probably have 6 topics per day in the eHealth Embark program. It's extremely comprehensive, and if it doesn't provide the answers to your questions with regard to getting your business and your product HSE or NHS or private health ready, we will, if we haven't included it in the content of the program, we will get you that advice. So we hope that at the end of the program, you are ready for the next step. So you get business mentoring along the way. So it's 6 weekly seminars along with business mentoring, which includes aspects such as identifying your clinical need. Have you identified a need? Have you built a product to suit the need, or have you built the product first and then later, try to figure out, is there actually a need for this product? So then we help you to validate your solution from a market point of view, and then we help you to size the market to see what the market opportunity might be. To develop a minimum viable product that then you can get out to users and to start getting feedback and work in an iterative way then in your product development. We'll help you to build a product roadmap, and you eventually pitch your innovation for the grand prize of $100,000 worth of AWS credits to build your business within AWS infrastructure, which is it's not the only infrastructure out there, but it is very recognized and appreciated by the HSE. It gives you a good head start if you're built on AWS. So then AWS provide the tech mentoring and the sorry, I'm in a dark corner here, so I have a light shining in my face. The tech mentoring, so we learned from experience that participants need, first of all, to audit their current tech infrastructure, because you may have created something on white label with add-ons and plugins. So you may need to audit that at first to see what do you have. Then identify your growth needs, create a scale-up plan, develop a proof of concept, and build a tech roadmap. And all participants get €2,000 of AWS credits to begin building on AWS. We're launching this program on the 1st of December, and we will be recruiting from January. So if you would like more information on the program, please do contact us at support@dconnect.ie, and we will be very happy to answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I'm just going to say thanks very much. We've gone 2 minutes over, so I hope that you're not too hungry. And I want to say thanks very much to Lisa and Alan for your time and expertise. That was very valuable. And thank you so much for participating today. And thanks to all our participants.
Thank you.
Okay, bye now.
Thank you.